All right. Well, we want to welcome you all here tonight. I'm Chris Root at Edgewood, and this is the third of our series. Sorry, the host. Okay, I got it. This is the third of our series on Palestine, and the focus tonight is on strategies for solidarity with Palestine. And it's a huge topic. We're just going to dip into a lot of things, introduce a lot of things, and we're going to break this into two sections. One is that I'm going to interview Stephen Gasteyer, who is another member of our Palestine group at Edgewood, who's been involved in Palestine for a long time. So we thought that kind of format might help us introduce a lot of different topics and cover a number of things. And then we're extremely glad that Jamie Davidson has joined us tonight from the Michigan State University Students United for Palestinian Rights. One of the things that's clear about doing any kind of social justice work is you need to do it in coalitions. You need to be together with people if you're going to accomplish things. And it's just wonderful to have SUPR here in our town. And Jamie is going to take some time after I interview Stephen to talk about what SUPR has done in the last couple of years. So we're going to do this interview, then maybe a little bit of time for question, and then Jamie, and then a little bit more time for discussion. And the plan is that we'll end at about 8:15. So Stephen, great. We thought that people would be interested, since the election just happened, in what difference that election might make in the US. Will it make a difference that we will not have a second Trump administration? We will have an administration of Biden and Harris.
So in some ways, so there's a song by Steve Earle that's Christmas Time in Washington. And it's Christmas time in Washington, and Democrats rehearse to getting gear for 4 more years of things not getting worse. And that's, in some ways, that's sort of how you can think about the Biden, going back to Biden. Things won't get better, and they probably will get worse. But there's depressing for you. But the Trump administration was remarkable in that they lit into and pursued all the of what Israelis would have called the right-wing agenda. Right? So moving the embassy to Jerusalem, putting in place not just sort of making a lot of noise and doing nothing, but actually encouraging land expropriation, encouraging annexation, signing peace deals peace deals that actually cemented in place the potential for annexation of large tracts of land in the West Bank, cavorting with not just the Israeli right, but the actual settlers movement. All of that was part of what the Trump administration had done for 4 years, and there was every indication they were going to do more of it, right? And the Biden administration, I think Biden has said outright that he doesn't support settlements and he does not support annexation. The Obama administration did that as well, and there was a steady land confiscation and settlement during the Biden administration. So you move back to an administration that will say some of the right things and has no history of doing much of any to stop the bad things, except that rhetoric does make a difference. So you can get a certain amount of rhetoric out of or I think we can expect that we'll be able to get a certain amount of rhetoric out of the Biden and Harris administration about human rights, about respect for international law, about two-state solution. They'll talk a lot about that. They'll sort of ditch this deal of the century thing. But that's what we can expect, right? That's sort of where it will end. Certainly, I don't envision a Biden administration cutting military aid or cutting military aid or putting significant pressure on Israel without being pushed from the other side. They may go along with things if they get enough pressure from inside the Democratic Party, then they might go along with pressure, but only if they're pushed in that direction. They aren't going to be in the lead on things.
That's a segue to the Congress, because of course, anytime you're dealing with military aid, anytime you're dealing with money, the Congress has to be involved. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us a little bit about what the focus on Israel and Palestine has been recently, and what you might anticipate for the next session that would matter to folks who want to support Palestine's struggle?
I think the big thing is that there are a couple of bills that were introduced in the last session. They're not going to go anywhere before the next session, that were intended to put some pressure on Israel. One of them actually involves cutting military aid as a penalty for any move to annex land in the West Bank. That I have not read anyone who said that had much of a chance of going anywhere, but it's out there. The second is Betty McCollum's bill, which is a much more targeted bill that looks at cuts of military aid based on mistreatment of children. So they want it calls for the State Department to get assurances of better treatment of aid of children, Palestinian children, Israel, and threatens cuts to the military budget if they won't do that. I'll get into this later, but I have some reason to believe that might actually be may have some legs to it. Right? Mm-hmm. So it's as rhetorical, if nothing else, right? But you might be able to get enough support that it might get the attention of people. Mm-hmm. There will be ongoing efforts in Congress to demonize BDS. I think we can expect that, especially from the Republicans, maybe from certain Democrats, but as a way of sort of shoring up their credentials. I don't expect that. I don't expect from the Democratic side more than we've seen already. From the Republican side, there may be an increase in that kind of thing because they're going to be desperate to flaunt what power they can get, and they can get. Actually, honestly, I think the big voting bloc that is important on these declarations of anti-BDS is the Christian right. And that's who they want to continue to mobilize.
Yeah.
So we'll see some of that as well. And then I don't know. I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has thoughts about other stuff that they see down the pike. But those are the big things that I've seen.
Okay. Many of us are in the district of Representative Alyssa Slotkin, who was reelected. She'll be a second-term Democrat, and she worked in the Pentagon before going to the Congress, and has been very much involved in Middle East policy. You've told me that you've had some discussions with her and her staff. I wonder if you can share some of that about what role you think she might play.
So I don't know that she'll play a role per se, but I can tell you that so there are a couple. So let me start with the bad news, which is that she has a knee-jerk reaction to any discussion of boycott, divestment, sanctions, any of those kinds of things as being negative. She doesn't say anti-Semitic, which is helpful, but she does say that it's singling out Israel, it's unfair, it demonizes the whole country. Now that leads to the caveat, which is that she actually talks about how during her time in Israel, she was part of a women's group that was involved in trying to achieve greater understanding and rapprochement between Israeli and Palestinian women. So she, while she's very committed to Israel, she is committed to the Israeli left, or at least that's the stance she's chosen to take. And where that comes down on policy is that actually when I raised with her and her staff the Betty McCollum's bill on no way to treat a child, she was very amenable to thinking about that and could be convinced, especially when it gets raised in terms of this actually is not good for Israel's interests either. Right, that there's you know, I think you can make the argument that there's no better way to radicalize Palestinian youth than to arrest them and put them through the kinds of court cases that they go through and put them through the kind of torture that the IDF routinely does to people that they arrest, and then release them have behind in school, so that they're easy targets, right? And that you can make that argument and it resonates with her. So, so the good news is on these kinds of moderate, what I would call somewhat moderate proposals, you could actually make some progress with Alyssa Slotkin, which could be useful, right? I mean, these are, so that, I think that's something to pursue and something to keep pursuing and trying to understand how to use that as a leverage point.
Yeah. And since she's part of the sort of self-identified moderate caucus, the problem-solving caucus, that is important. These kinds of discussions wouldn't have gone on 10 years ago, I think. So one has to keep some perspective. There's so much you've brought up that, you know, we could go on about a lot, but one of I think that would be good to transition. You were talking about how people demonize BDS in Congress, almost across the board. BDS is a very important type of nonviolent tactic that has been used prominently internationally. And I wonder if you could give us a little background on where that comes from regarding Palestine in particular.
Well, again, I'll welcome anyone stepping in and adding to my particular take on it. But BDS comes out of thinking in Palestine about what are ways to fight for the Palestinian justice side of armed struggle and the same old strikes and you know, civil disobedience at checkpoints and those kinds of things. And Mustafa Barghouti came up with the notion that what we ought to be calling for is a boycott campaign that really mirrors what the ANC used in South Africa. And so that's where the divestment comes from, and the notion of sanctions comes out of international law, right? And sort of a recognition that Israel almost on a day-to-day basis operate in violation of international law, and therefore ought to be sanctioned. And given that we have governments that are increasingly compliant or unwilling to take stands against Israel, then this needs to be a citizen movement. That therefore the boycott and the divestment strategy, right? Because the divestment strategy in South Africa was devised as a way to operate outside of the realm of government, to side with the people who are under the thumb of apartheid. The boycott part of the movement is actually pretty specific about going after companies that are doing work in Israel. It is further specified because the BDS campaign is not meant to be unilateral. So you can decide that your part of the boycott campaign can be about all companies that work in Israel. That makes shopping really tricky in the United States. It could be about those companies that are explicitly working as part of the occupation of what has been deemed Palestinian territory. And so there's actually an easy list that gets put up. So you could, don't buy, well, actually, can I show the screen? Yeah, is that possible, or is that not going to be possible?
Yeah, you can.
Okay, so let me just show you. You all can see this screen right here from the boycott, from the US Campaign for Palestinian Rights. And I'll highlight this set of companies. So Ahava, with beauty products, Airbnb, which is the online hotel, or people put up their houses. Then ice cream, that's the one that hurts me the most, I have to tell you. There, okay. G4S, that's a securities firm. HP Computer, and the Jewish National Fund, Remax Real Estate, Sabra Hummus, and SodaStream. All of them are doing work, are either located on settlements or support settlement activities in the West Bank, right? So it's a very targeted list. You could then pull up the bigger list, which goes on and on and on. But these are, if we could just get unity around these boycotts, it would actually make a difference in terms of sending the message, right? And by doing these kinds of targeted boycotts, the BDS movement, the activists would say that what has people so upset about BDS is that it has actually been successful. They can give you a fairly long list of victories where corporations felt they had to draw back from their work with Israel and with the IDF because of the popular boycott campaigns against them. So I think it's interesting. As a social movement scholar, it's one of the that I follow. Both the strategy of the BDS campaign and the reaction against it, the backlash, I find very interesting, and I think there's a lot of evidence to that this is one way that can add their voice, and it can, the backlash campaign says that this is just about the destruction of Israel. What's very clear to me from reading the movement's literature is that it's not meant to be that dictatorial. It's really about sending a series of messages. And so you can decide how you want to be in your boycott.
You mentioned a little bit that the strategies or the tactics of boycott and divestment has some history in the anti-apartheid movement regarding South Africa. And some of us were involved in that, and there was actually a what was called a selective purchasing proposal in the East Lansing City Council back early in the 1970s. And lo and behold, somebody from the South African embassy came and testified against it. And it's striking, I think, that not only have progressives concerned about Palestine learned from the anti-apartheid South Africa divestment campaign, but the Israeli government watched very carefully and I think was activist, well-resourced and activist against the BDS campaign in the United States. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that has expressed itself.
So there's the response in the United States has ranged from popular campaigns, activists and in particular scholars who have taken a stand as part of the BDS movement have found themselves on lists and found their emails, either found their found themselves listed as hostile to Jewish students. Ways that's one of the strategies. So whether you've ever the note, you know, but the people did this as well, right? The notion is that if you are critical of Israel, then you're anti-Semitic. And if you are pro everything that Israel does, then there's no way you could possibly be anti-Semitic, right? And that tactic used by non-governmental organizations to try to brand professors, brand public figures as anti-Semitic for being part of the BDS movement. So that's been one strategy, but the other strategy has been to, and then there have been explicit efforts to mobilize student groups, for instance, against the student organizations that have tried to advocate for Palestinian rights generally and advocating around BDS in particular. The other strategy has then been to move into the legislatures, and again, drawing heavily on the voter base of the Christian right that adopted the pro-Israel and then anti-BDS movement. And so they've pushed through laws across the country, including in our state,
right.
Prohibit government money going to institutions that support the BDS, you know, declare that they will engage in boycotts or divestment campaigns. So the movement has been very sophisticated. It has put some real dampers on the ability to use this strategy. And as I said before, I think that's because the strategy was starting to have some legs to it. And so far as I know, everything has held up in terms of court challenges, but others may know better than me. Which is to say, there's an argument to be made that this is a violation of First Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. Right to free speech. I should be able to. I and my organization should be able to choose where we spend our money, right? And be able to declare that we have chosen. But so far, the way they crafted those laws has seemed to be immune to that. So,
Yeah.
So that's been the backlash as far as I know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. One last question I'd like to ask before we give some time to Jamie to talk about campus organizing is, where do we look for leadership on all these issues? There's such diverse issues to follow, and there's an increasing number of folks doing some really valuable, wonderful work. So can you just give us a couple of ideas of organizations that you think are worth keeping tabs on to give us leadership?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with a caveat, which is that there are people on this call who know of really good organizations and are connected to really good organizations. And so I am by no means the authority on this. I have some ideas. And I would love to hear other people's ideas. I would say that I really like the work that the Friends are doing. AFSC has been working on this issue for months, and the stuff they do out of the AFSC office, and then in terms of legislation, Friends Committee on National Legislation is very solid. Right? They're well researched. They're people who've been doing this for a long time. I think they provide a nice background. I think that FOSNA is the Friends of Seville are likewise folks who are very well grounded, very well connected. They're thinking about sort of at least the Christian angle on these things. And then UCC has something called the Palestine Information National. And they are gathering up really good in a range of things. So that's connected directly to the Peace Church community. Outside of that, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights does, they are really leading the charge on the boycott issues. And then there's a plethora of organizations, right, that have been sort of working on different parts of the angle. They tend to very much be in coalition. So looking at how those organizations are mobilizing, in terms of understanding analysis of what's going on with Palestinians, I really like the Institute for Palestine Studies, right, as a site that they put out both the academic publications. There's something called the Journal of Palestine Studies and then the Journal of Jerusalem Studies. For people who want to dive deeper, those are reliable publications, reliably well-researched publications, sort of academic study. But then they have a part called Manar, which is basically the square, and they'll write on things. So they, in the middle of the election, they had actually posted analysis by a couple of people of what is a likely Biden campaign supposed to do, expected to do, right? Yeah. It's just as an example. And so that is an easy place to go to get information that's about what the issues are. And they'll do, special sessions on things, the issues of water and land and the annexation of the Jordan Valley. Right? So there's I'm sure lots of other sites, and I hope people will bring them up over, but those are the ones that I can. Oh, and there's if you want stuff that's I also go to the Electronic Intifada, which I find does really great stories on often the U.S. side of what's going on.
Could you say that one again?
Electronic Intifada.
Oh, Electronic Intifada. Yeah, you're breaking up just a little. But
oh, okay. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So so those are the sites. Yeah, those are the sites that I
Wonderful.
go to.
Wonderful, thank you. And yes, there are many, many other people doing good work, but those are really helpful ones to raise up. I want to be sure to give Jamie time. So I think I'm going to switch the thought of having a break for questions here and go straight to Jamie. And then we can, have whatever discussion people would like at that point. So Liz, if you could switch over to Jamie to talk about what the Students United for Palestinian Rights has had as their approach on campus here. We're looking forward to hearing from her about that.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Stephen, as always, for your wisdom. It's good to hear from you again.
Great.
While since we're all stuck in quarantine.
Yeah, exactly.
Oops, sorry. Hey guys, again, my name's Jamie. I'm really excited to be here and just see that there's interest in the community in organizing for justice in Palestine. Having community support means so much to our organization, more than you probably can even imagine. I'm going to try to communicate tonight to you how much, because I'd really like to, stay in contact with you guys after this. So just to reintroduce myself, I'm Jamie Davidson, and I'm a senior at Michigan State University, as well as the president of Students United for Palestinian Rights, or SUPR as we call it. And I've been a part of this organization since I was a freshman. And it's given me way more than I even anticipated when I first joined, to the extent that it's actually probably the most important experience that I've had in college. And this picture that I'm using as the title slide is one that I took when I visited Jerusalem for the first time 2 summers ago. And to me, before college, visiting Palestine was a really fraught idea. Since I'm a Jewish American, it's exceptionally easy for me to visit historic Palestine. I remember actually a speaker from Jewish Voice for Peace saying that when he visited in the past, they offered him Israeli citizenship in the TSA line. And that specific access, it casts one of the darkest shadows on the Jewish community in our, long history. So before I joined SUPR, I was really not planning on traveling there, which I used to attribute to a campaign called Return the Birthright, which was in response to birthright trips, which you guys might know about, which gave they still exist, American Jews a free trip to Israel and kind of indoctrinate them with propaganda. But in reality, I think I was probably avoiding interacting with that darkness in a real sense. So when I got to college, I was encouraged by multiple members of this group, as well as professors and friends, to visit. So when I did a study abroad in Amman, Jordan, which is an hour from the border to the West Bank, I decided to go. And anyone who's visited there, as Stephen can tell you, I'm sure, they'll tell you how intense it is to be among, all that weight, all that history, and to be literally standing on layers and layers of these reconstructed stories of whose home it is and the physical manifestation of those beliefs. It's the space that's passionately held onto by so many people, and that passion drives the organizing of hundreds of thousands of people around the globe every year. And one of the largest organizations of Palestinians and pro-Palestine allies is the National Organization Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, of which our organization is just a small branch. And it's an organization dedicated to intersectional organizing for both the liberation of Palestine, but also other peoples facing colonial occupation or racist oppression. And chapters are usually housed within university institutions because of the specific impact that BDS organizing can have on that large amount of money that universities have to throw around. However, the organizations we collaborate with, all sorts of institutions, anti-institutions, communities, etc. And the work we do is really informed by that vast intersection of violences that draw together histories of numerous colonial projects, but examines them from this place of knowing that they're fleeting, that they're unstable, and that the power of the people who have had to protect their communities against that violence is always going to prevail. So SUPR has been very intentional about focusing on that connecting thread for the past 3 years. This is just a few of the events, like probably not even half of the events that we've had in the past few years, just to give you a bit of an idea of what our organizing looks like. And I'll go through them quickly in a minute, but I first wanted to explain this image in the background, which is a photograph that I took at one of the Detroit Will Breathe protests this past summer of the murder of George Floyd. And before I turned my focus to organizing for Palestine, when I came to college, I worked on Black Lives Matter and anti-deportation campaigns, which unfortunately will likely still be just as vital in the coming 4 years as they have been in the past. But the intersections between these issues and Palestine are so important to understand because the United States, especially the police and ICE, are a major facilitator of the occupation of Palestine. And I didn't fully understand the relationship until many of these events that I have listed here. And not only the way that it's the occupation of Palestine, but also how it resonates in America and why we're still fighting this fight. It has a lot to do with this intersection. So this first one here, Cultivating Resistance, Food Justice in Palestine, was with an organization called Uprooted and Rising, which discusses kind of the slow food movement and trying to get university institutions to invest their money in purchasing slow food as opposed to like Tyson chicken and things like that. Then there was the Deadly Exchange, Turning Everyday Police into Soldiers, which discussed the literal exchange of police tactics, trainings, money, and weapons between Israel and the United States that literally train our police to be just as militarized and violent as they are today. Then there was From Detroit to Gaza, Black Solidarity with Palestine, which was with the Black Student Union, and the speaker was Christian Bailey of Black for Palestine. And that was just he kind of gave us a personal story about his realization of the importance of the intersection between organizing for Black liberation and also Palestinian liberation, which was amazing. Then we had On Anti-Semitism with Jewish Voice for Peace, and we actually had another event with them last year, but I don't even remember what it was. Very interesting discussion because of the fact that anti-Semitism is so often brought into discussions of Palestine. Then there was the refugee experience with Students Organized for Syria, which obviously the enormous numbers of refugees which have come out of the occupation of Palestine can easily be, mirrored with the crisis in Syria. Just this past week, we had a discussion of police as a tool of colonialism, which was with a speaker from the Red Nation, which is a Native organization which advocates for Native liberation. And similarly, last year we had an event with Stephen as one of the speakers called Tools of Colonial Land Theft, which talked about kind of the bureaucratic lawmaking ways that colonialism actually happens. And then we had a fundraiser for Black Millennials for Flint on World Water Day, which is an amazing organization in Flint that works for environmental justice for Flint residents. And then Without Walls with Culturas de las Razas Unidas, which was kind of a very emotional discussion of how borders actually impact students' lives in America. So that's just a small portion of the events we have, but there's also more ones that aren't so focused on the teaching aspect of our group. We also have a lot of cultural and like social events, such as you can see at the top, this is a picture of some people debcating at an event we have every year called PaliFest, which is just a cultural festival that was in response to the fact that there was one at MSU called Israel Fest, which now has shut down because nobody ever went to it, and ours continues. So this is people dancing, having a good time, and this is the food from last year's event. And then on the right, this was a protest led by the Palestinian youth movement against the deal of the century in Detroit of 2020. So there's a lot of different ways that our group is involved in, different types of events. And this year, because of the attention that the Black Lives Matter movement got this past summer, we decided to spend the entire year focusing our events on how important the relationship between police brutality in America is, and in different locations all across the globe, including Palestine. So how police are literally, a tool of colonialism and are like the actual workers which make colonial projects, happen in America, in Palestine, all over the world. But also then how they are the force which is able to continue to suppress people from uprisings and maintain inequality, class inequality, and racial inequality in many nations across the globe. And so we just had our third event last week, and we are recording all of them. So if anybody wants to view any of those recordings, I can put our YouTube channel in the chat in a moment. But also, if you want to get connected in any other way, our social media is at the bottom of the screen if you guys use social media, or also I can put our email address in the chat in a moment. But I also just wanted to invite another member of our e-board, actually did make it out tonight. And if she wants to kind of say anything else, I wanted to invite you to do that. Now she's using a synonym, so I don't want to say it.
Hi guys, how are you all doing? I'm so happy to be here, and I hope that you can hear me. I'm in Chicago and there's sirens all around me, so if it's loud, I do apologize. My name is Cerise. I graduated from MSU actually in May, so I'm a COVID grad and I'm super happy about it. I'm really just here to support Jamie, and I just wanted to listen in and to see what you guys are talking about, and everything that Steven said and everything that Jamie said, I amend, and I'm so happy that they're here and speaking to you guys. Yeah, I don't really have much to say, but if you guys have any questions, or if there's time for questions, I'd be super happy to participate in or listen to anything.
So glad you've joined us. Thank you, even from Chicago. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Happy to be here.
Yeah. Jamie, it is just wonderful that you shared this with us. Did you want to share any more, or are we going into questions and discussion now?
I wanted to leave some time for questions, but
Yeah, great.
yeah, I'll
Great.
put the YouTube link in the chat now, though.
Okay. Well, so many organizations talk about coalition building and intersectionality, and there are few organizations I know who do it as much as SUPR does, and I just find it really inspiring. And I'm just so glad you could join us and share that with us. And I appreciate your welcome to have people participate in your events. I've participated in a couple of them and they've been really high quality. So I encourage people to reach out and do that.
Yeah, I think it cannot be overstated how much it means to have community support, not only from students, but also from the entire community, because of the fact that SJP specifically as an organization is one of the more villainized organizers on the Palestinian Justice Act movement. It's so important to have people of all walks of life involved, because at some point, if we want to pass a BDS resolution, we're going to get called anti-Semites. Even though I'm Jewish, we're going to get called anti-Semites. And so it doesn't, just having so many people hear us is really powerful. So thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. Liz, can we go back to the, what is it, gallery mode so we can see each other?
Is it not? I stopped sharing my screen.
It is. If in the upper right-hand corner, you can choose either speaker view or gallery view.
Got it. Got it.
Boxes.
Okay, so we are open for people to ask questions or make other contributions. I am not able to see everybody, so people should just speak up. I see John Masterson has.
Yes, Jamie, you said you were going to leave us your email address. I'm not on any social media, and I would very much like your email address. I'm a retired faculty member at Michigan State.
Yes, it's in the chat. I just put it in there. I'm still trying to figure out how to get the channel link. Hold on a second.
John, I'll make sure that you get it.
Actually, that works just as well, Jamie. Thank you.
Oh,
Yeah.
do you not
Don't
see?
need to worry about it.
Yeah, don't worry about it now. It's
Yeah, I've got it.
let the discussion go on.
Yeah. Is there anything else you wanted to mention, John?
No, not really.
Okay, great. Who else would like to share some thoughts or question?
I have a question. Amy and anyone else on the line, can you say anything about the retaliation that's actually been experienced on the MSU campus or in our community here by people speaking up on Palestinian rights?
Yeah, definitely. We are lucky enough that we have not had a ton of retaliation. I'm not sure if you discussed it in previous events, but there's actually a blacklist of organizers' names called Canary Mission, which is one of the major threats to students when they organize on this issue. Because when you get put on this list, if people search your name on the internet, it's one of the first things that comes up, and it says, this person's a racist, this person's an anti-Semite, and they are a terrorist, and all sorts of things. And so it's a major inhibitor for students trying to go to grad school, trying to get jobs, and especially Palestinian students who are trying to go home. Thankfully, no one on our e-board has been put on it, but I know our faculty advisor has been, and all of the students that I know who have tried to run a divestment campaign on their campuses have got input on it. So that's like one of the major things that I know of. But you know, thankfully we haven't had as much Zionist retaliation as other universities.
Good to hear.
Yes, thank you.
Someone
So,
else?
who is behind that?
Canary Mission.
Yes.
So it's actually kind of it's not a mystery because we know actually, but there's a documentary about it that was actually banned in America that was produced by Al Jazeera. Oh God, I don't remember what it's called. I can pull it up in a second, but it talked about how these groups such as like the Jewish National Fund or the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee kind of recruit students who are involved in Zionist organizations on campus to kind of go and sit in on events that we run and kind of try and pick up names, try and pick up information. And the amount of information that's published on these sites is pretty insane. They take your tweets and everything basically you've ever said, they put it on the internet, and it's very creepy. But it is usually other students that are recruited to do kind of little, like, almost like spy work, you know? I can pull it up if you guys want to see the website.
Yeah, I was just
In
on it.
in the 70s and 80s when Palestinian American student, I'll speak when you're finished.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, so here's an example. Angela Najjar is somebody they're currently targeting. She's at Wayne State University. And it's this kind of stuff that they'll put up about people without a whole lot of evidence, right? And they'll sort of take quotes out of context, and you can imagine. I think Angela. I'm not sure who Angela Najjar is, but you know, you can imagine, as Jamie was saying, right? So if she's a student, she's going to be graduating. She's going to be going out to get a job. This becomes really problematic. It's just the last thing. David Horowitz, the famous formerly left-wing turned right-wing tour, is one of the people, at least, who's behind the Canary Mission, I think. Does that sound right, Jamie? You may know more better than me.
Maybe. I'm not 100% sure. Let me see if I can find the name of that document.
Yeah. So I'm sorry. Who was somebody was saying something very.
Well, I wanted to talk about something that goes back, 30 to 40 years. When Sameh Esmail, which was the case that brought me more deeply into Palestine, was arrested and served 9 months of 15 months. He was a Palestinian American student, so he had American citizenship. But he served 9 months in Israeli prison. The material that was brought up at his trial was all gathered on MSU's campus. So it was not. Sammy didn't go anywhere. He was one of the leaders of the, I think it was the Arab Student Organization at the time, and he spoke for them. He was raised in Brooklyn, actually. He was raised in the New York area, and he was going back to the funeral of his father who had died when he was arrested. But it was arrested through material that was gathered by students or who knows whatever, or by what Israeli Secret Service people that are even on American campuses. It was probably students. I don't know. I'll just throw that in. Long time ago. So
I also did find the name. It's called Occupation of the American Mind, Israel's Public Relations War in the United States. And I put the name and link to that movie in the chat if you guys know how to use the chat function of Zoom. And here's the YouTube link to our YouTube channel if you are interested in watching the events I mentioned before, recordings of them.
Thanks for putting that up, Jamie.
The title was Occupation of the Public Mind.
The American Mind, yeah.
American Mind.
I'll send these links to folks whose address I have in case you're not comfortable with chat.
Did I get unmuted? Yeah, Stephen, you talked about particular legislation. Are there caucuses or individuals, groups or individuals within Congress who are working on the Palestinian advocacy issues?
Can you get any closer to the mic, Lynn?
I was asking Stephen if there are caucuses or groups within the legislature, Congress, that are allies.
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question. I think it does seem that there's a solid group of progressives in Congress who are, we've been, for decades when I worked on this issue, you basically had two friends of Palestinians in Congress, and it was David Bonnier, who of course came from Dearborn, or represented Dearborn, and then Traficant, who had his own issues. James Traficant was a very bombastic congressperson from Youngstown, Ohio, who eventually, I think he's still currently in prison because he was deeply engaged in, I could call them Trumpian activities at this point, but for decades that was kind of it. What's interesting now is you actually have a growing number of those progressive flank of the Democratic Party who come in with a critical stance towards Israel. So the Squad, and they're now joined by Jamal Bowman and at least one other person, right? One other of the new representatives. So now we're up to 5, 6, 7 congressional members, which is better than 2. And then you have people like Betty McCollum, who comes from Minneapolis and has made and decided to take a stand on this issue. I think as Bibi Netanyahu moves right, that helps moderates who would otherwise not be willing to speak up to sort of step out on issues that are relatively safe, but again, can make inroads, right? And so Betty McCollum's bill is, literally here she has, it had a number and everything for the last Congress. HR 2407, promoting human rights for Palestinian children living under Israeli occupation. And that was the act, right? And she comes at it as just sort of a reasonable, level-headed Midwestern thing. We don't mistreat children, right? And so that actually had more than just 7 co-sponsors in the last. Yeah, so it's got, here, I'll share the screen again, because you can see in the last session, at least, what is that, 20 co-sponsors? So, and they're, no, none of them are Republicans, but by the same token, that's more than just, that's more than no representatives who are willing to actually more than just say they will support, step up as co-sponsors for this bill. So I think there's at least some hope that there can be a voice for these issues, if not actual legislation that gets passed in the legislature right now. I don't know, hopefully that answers, I mean, that's pretty much as we can say at this point, I think.
Well, I think the good news was that Rashida Tlaib from Detroit, who
Yes.
took Congress seat, and Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar were all reelected in their districts. So presumably there'll be a core of whatever goes through in the House.
Other comments or questions?
The one last thing I'll add is that the churches, the church organizations in Washington of the peace church, so-called peace churches, so the Quakers, the UCCs, the Brethren, but also the denominational, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, are tracking these kinds of things on Palestine. They've all sort of been there, and they walk the halls, and they're trying to, they have their, I mean, you know, Connie and John have both been on delegations that were organized by the churches, right? By the Mennonites in one case. Connie, I can't remember which church you guys went as part of.
It was Disciples of Christ.
Yeah, so, and they are going and they're bringing people back, and their offices in Washington are working on these issues. And so I don't think it's absolutely hopeless to get at least voice for these issues, because those denominational groups are actually there working and trying to quietly influence and think about what can be influenced. Again, Friends Committee on National Legislation does a really nice job of sort of monitoring what's going on the Hill and what are the opportunities to say something about Palestine. So it's worth following those things and then figuring out when we can step up and send a letter of support, right, and move something forward.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's true that United Church of Christ, Presbyterians, Methodists, EUB, who am I missing? Methodists for sure, have all had national resolutions in their national meetings or associations on these issues, and they're fairly forthright. Several of whom support BDS, including the United Church of Christ. And so,
the United Methodist Kairos Response Group is celebrating its 10th anniversary next week with a webinar. People have been doing some wonderful webinars.
Yeah.
Just how strong are the groups in Israel, the Jews, in this problem, shall we say, or are working toward settlement of these problems? Settlement maybe isn't the right word, but progress.
Are there some allies?
Right.
In other words,
among the Jews in Israel.
Anyone want to? Well, I would say actually there's and like the peace movement in the United States, the peace movement in Israel is varied. So it moves between organizations like Peace Now, which is almost so moderate that it's not very effective at this point, not very effectual. It's to groups like the Committee Against House Demolitions, which is actually sends people out to try to stop house demolitions, right? And so, and there's a full range, I mean, of organizations. I mean, that's like the peace movement here. There's a coalition, and it is pretty marginal in terms of politics, but it's there. And if you were to go to demonstrations in the West Bank, you may well run into Israelis, people of Israeli descent who have shown up to be part of the nonviolent witness movement, and there's a whole movement of soldiers who have come back and then, formed an organization to talk about how horrible, what an affront it was to their moral core to serve as part of the IDF or the Border Patrol in the West Bank. So those organizations do exist and are and do speak up, and they are, frankly, again, part of the message to someone like Elizabeth Slotkin is those organizations are looking for signs of the United States that they're not alone, that they're going to get some support from outside of Israel if they speak up, right? And so there is something to be said for remembering those organizations are there, and in as much as they're willing to take a stand to working with them. Now, again, there's ranges, right? So there are, you have to sort of know who you're working with and understand to what extent by working with them, it's like any movement. Those organizations that are on the out and so on and so forth, but they're there and they could be partnered with, and they can provide inroads that can help you make some progress in terms of advocating for Palestinian justice.
Yeah,
And are they ostracized in Israel? Are they ostracized?
It depends on the organization, but it depends on the organization and where they live and who they interact with. But there's, it's a group that I did some work with decades ago. I don't even know around anymore. It was called Derech Hanitzot, and they were anti-Zionist Israelis. And they were completely ostracized. I mean, they served time in Israeli prison. They were charged with sedition. They were, they really, laid their quality of life and in many cases their well-being on the line for their beliefs. But they were there and they were allowed to live. But minimally, they paid a price for it. Others, if you're a member of Peace Now, I'm sure there's Netanyahu supporters who don't like you, but other than you're sort of mainstream, right? So, so it really depends. Go ahead, Jamie. I know you've been trying to get in.
No, that's okay. Yeah, I know that similarly, there is a large group of Israeli citizens who refused their obligatory military service under the, saying we don't want to be a part of violent occupation. And those people often do go to jail or have some pretty severe consequences for that. But additionally, there are a lot of, outside of Israel, there are a lot of anti-Zionist Jewish organizations in America, like Jewish Voice for Peace, and a little bit more moderate, there's If Not Now, and a couple other groups. But yeah, I think it's important to remember that distinction between Jewish and Zionist people. But it's also, when you're, I do want to say that I would caution against those sort of groups which focus on, dialogue type of, a type of peace-centered approach instead of justice or reconciliation type of approach, because of the fact that, the largest kind of issues that we've had to face with campus Zionists is them trying to promote that sort of dialogue. And last year there was actually an event where they had one of those dialogue sessions, And our group turned out to it, but we kind of just sat in the audience to see what was going to happen. It was one of the most bizarre events I've ever had the misfortune of going to at MSU, which is kind of saying a lot. But but it was really just some of the most obvious settler colonial rhetoric that's been planted into unfortunately, a lot of Jewish students' brains. And it was kind of repeated and then also like justified in that space by being like, oh, we're taking the other side into consideration, when really it's just kind of very almost violently kind of trying to make space for both sides in the argument when you're talking about violent oppression. So that's often most of the Israeli organizations that I've seen have been kind of focused on that. But there are groups like Boycott from Within, which are more radical, I will say.
I think that the many groups make it difficult for those of us who've not been core to them for decades to decide on who to support. Each year at Edgewood, we put out a leaflet, which we're putting together actually this week, called To Whom Should We Give in 2021, which is, we try to target what are the groups that are focusing upon advocacy for justice and peace issues. And so, you know, I was sitting with the leaflet yesterday and wondering, what should we have on our leaflet here about how we encourage Edgewoodians to give their private giving to groups in support of advocating for justice in Palestine. I know it's a difficult question, so feel free not to answer or you can send me suggestions, but I just think it's a bit of a mystery for those of us who want to be supportive, but don't know what is the wisest and most strategic an important place to put the small resources we have.
Dave, if I could come in here. The Good Shepherd Collective, you know, you're familiar with Cody and the work that he's done.
Right.
Right now they're engaged in a olive tree planting program, and I can send you information about that. For some folks, you know, doing something physical like that as opposed to some kind of political advocacy is maybe more approachable for some folks as opposed to the political advocacy. Not that we shouldn't be doing, we should be doing the political advocacy, but it is a statement because not only is home demolitions going on, we know that olive groves are being destroyed and burned and so forth, and it is a source of livelihood for the people there. So I'll send you some information about that. I had sent out a fundraising letter to the church in the Michigan district about that. Cody and I came up with that for the Church of the Brethren in particular, because they're those kind of folks, they're kind of hands-on, and so that's why we wanted to do something like that. But of course, there's the other aspects that he's been working on, which have to do with what's happening with the nonprofits here in the United States that are supporting settler groups under the guise of nonprofit status. That's a real problem, and that's something that needs to be dealt with, and that's something that the Good Shepherd Collective is working on. So those are just a couple of ideas.
I think most of you have seen the resource list that we put out in conjunction with this series. And there is a page of resources about the event for tonight. And also on the last page, a list of websites with a lot of good information, many of which are advocacy focused. So you've actually got a list of a number of these groups that you can check out, and both in terms of resources, but also in terms of the possibility of giving both political and financial support. I think we should tie this up because we promised people we wouldn't go too long. This has been, I think, a wonderful discussion. I feel really blessed by all the people who are participating. particularly people beyond Edgewood. This is such a complex and important movement, and it is so important for us to be working together on it. And it is encouraging and strengthening to be together. And I really appreciate that. And I also want to express special appreciation to Jamie Davidson and Stephen Gasteyer for providing so much leadership over the years and leadership for us tonight. Our original pre-COVID plan was that we would invite you all to the community room at Edgewood for another meeting to talk about how we want to work together on this issue. And of course, that's not possible. And we haven't really figured out what is the next step when the next step isn't, another public Zoom meeting. We'd be happy to do more educational work if people think that's valuable. But in terms of doing advocacy work together, that's really where we would like to go. And I invite you, many of you got an email reminder from me, from my email address. Feel free to let me know that way if you'd like to participate on some solidarity work in the future. Or if you'd like to, hear when there are webinars coming up, whatever. And we'll try to, and also if you have suggestions about how we can work together in this complicated time, we'll do what we can to, facilitate that communication, even though I don't have a particular way of doing that I can make clear right now. This is what it's about. This is why we're getting together, is to try to work together to make a difference in support of Palestinian people. So I thank you very, very much for coming and for participating, and I look forward to remaining in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Chris.
Thank you to you, Chris.
Yeah.